Okay. All right, good evening. We are going to start the panel, the third panel tonight with Professor Erin Kelly. Erin Kelly is an associate professor and chair of the philosophy department in the School of Arts and Sciences and co-director of the Civic Studies program. Her research interests are in moral and political philosophy and philosophy of law, with a focus on questions about justice, the nature of moral reasons, moral responsibility, desert, and theories of punishment. I put here as well, Professor Kelly, that you have a non-academic interest in music, film, outdoors, and 2 young children, because as a mother, I always like it when we take our children to our work. I think it's very important for us to say where we are. And so, well, she has been, of course, she has many publications, but I would just cite 2: The Limits of Blame, Rethinking Punishment and Responsibility, and The Practice of Liberty, What is Pluralism? The Question of Pluralism in Politics. It's forthcoming. Her talk tonight is in the Circumstances of Justice. So thank you, Professor Kelly, for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here. I am going to share my screen so that I can include some slides. Let me just rearrange my screen for a moment. Okay. So here we go. The circumstances of justice are understood by political philosophers to represent not the particular history of a given society or societies, but a generalization about the human conflicts and needs common to all social and historical settings that give rise to the quest for justice. They take us back, if you will, to the plight of individual human beings in a state of nature. I will argue for a more expansive understanding of the circumstances of justice than the account John Rawls presents in A Theory of Justice, to include familiar forms of organized injustice. Reckoning with the history of organized injustice is typically delegated by Rawlsian and non-Rawlsian political philosophers alike to the realm of non-ideal or applied theory. By contrast, I locate historical injustice within the circumstances of justice that are relevant more generally to liberal theories of justice. I do this because historical injustice and its legacies shape the problems of justice that I think the resources of political philosophy, including those offered by Rawls, can and should help us to think about. In short, I'm proposing to reorganize the question to which Rawls provides some helpful answers. I arrive at a more expansive understanding of the circumstances of justice by engaging with Rawls's thoughts about the historical origins of political liberalism. Get these slides going. Political liberalism is Rawls's name for the philosophy of politically liberal conceptions of justice, all of which have 3 features. First, they're committed to certain basic rights, liberties, and opportunities, namely, Rawls says, those familiar from constitutional democracies. Second, politically liberal conceptions of justice accord a special priority to these basic rights, liberties, and opportunities. And third, they are committed to providing all citizens with the resources people need to make effective use of their basic rights, liberties, and opportunities. Rawls locates the origin of the philosophy of these features of liberal thought in the history of war and violence, specifically in early modern Europe. In my remarks, I will emphasize that the aftermath of war and other forms of group-based violence brings with it group-based harms that present difficult obstacles to justice. Though Rawls would not disagree, he does not accord the harms I have in mind much attention. Nevertheless, I believe the Rawlsian thought experiment which he introduces as the original position, has the potential to address them. Exploring the application of the Rawlsian thought experiment to the circumstances of historical injustice enables us to add something to what Rawls has to say about the good of justice. One aspect of the good of distributive justice is that it provides a basis for group-based reconciliation in the wake of historical injustice. In his later writings, Rawls emphasized that justice as fairness should be a form of political liberalism that does not assume or require moral consensus among people of differing religious and secular values. Though members of a pluralistic democracy will disagree about matters of ethics and religion, they might be brought to share political values, in particular, those connected with the three aspects of democratic justice I just summarized. Rawls proposes that a conception of democratic justice representing these values could be the object of an overlapping consensus. Sorry, lost my spot. My screen just jumped around. Okay. An overlapping consensus is a point of convergence among people's diverse life plans, a module of shared political values that fits into a variety of reasonable life plans. Rawls's interesting proposal might seem, however, to push the critical question back. How is an overlapping consensus possible? That is, how might those who endorse different and even conflicting moral and religious views come to identify and commit to a common set of political values? Where could the will to identify this formula for peace and justice come from? Rawls's answer to this question draws on historical experience. An overlapping consensus might emerge from the exhaustion of war, as it did in Europe after centuries of religious fighting. People who are tired of fighting have reason to identify common values. Out of the ashes of war's destruction, a modus vivendi, or peace of exhaustion, might emerge. That modus vivendi might evolve into a collective commitment to a liberal core of political values. This argument locates the possibility of political liberalism in what is called transitional justice. Transitional justice describes a political setting in which members of a society lack a commitment to mutual rights and obligations. There is no social contract. People are not mutually respecting members of a cooperative scheme. They are survivors. They are recent enemies, injured and traumatized. They approach one another in grief and with mistrust and resentment. They lack a common sense of justice, but they have reason to find common ground. The ending of their war presents an opportunity. Indeed, their circumstances make it necessary for them to forge a common future out of a destructive past. It's necessary for them to identify common values if they are to live together. The alternative is political splintering and the persistence of conflict and injustice, or disintegration and the abandonment through political secession of the possibility of a common society. The necessity of reaching agreement does not, however, show us how it is possible to achieve it. How might a wounded people or wounded peoples find their way forward together? Let's return to Rawls's thought. He writes, the historical origin of political liberalism and of liberalism more generally is the Reformation and its aftermath, with the long controversies over religious toleration in the 16th and 17th centuries. Something like the modern understanding of liberty of conscience and freedom of thought began then. As Hegel saw, pluralism made religious liberty possible, certainly not Luther's and Calvin's intention. End of quote. In considering Rawls's reference to the long controversies over religious toleration in the 16th and 17th centuries, we might think of Locke's letter on toleration and other important intellectual contributions to liberal political thought. But we might also concentrate on the circumstances that gave birth to the liberal values that Locke and others debated. Here, I submit, we need a wider understanding of the circumstances of justice than Rawls presents. From the vantage point of history, we can see that the circumstances of justice include organized forms of injustice and oppression. Rawls did not articulate this fully enough. His description is more individualistic. Following Hume, he describes the objective circumstances of justice to consist in resource scarcity, a rough equality of people's physical and mental powers, their mutual vulnerability to attack, and the need to share geographical territory. These circumstances describe the plight of individuals in a state of nature, as I suggested earlier. Rawls describes them as the normal conditions under which human cooperation is both possible and necessary. He remarks that because individuals are similar in physical and mental powers, no one among them can dominate the rest. While this might be true, strictly speaking, it is also true that groups of people are capable and have organized together with great commitment to dominate other groups. This is the case even though the underlying instability of oppressive social structures leads over time to eruptions of violence and war. We should conclude from the long history of war and violence that the objective circumstances of justice include the familiar dynamics of group domination and subordination. Injustice inflicts group-based harms, such as the social stigma of membership in an enslaved or formerly enslaved caste. Group-based harms are the consequence of historical injustice, which includes damage to what Rawls referred to as the social bases of self-respect. The social bases of self-respect are important components of democratic equality. This implies that democratic inclusion will demand a remedy to the harms of stigma. Democratic inclusion is a form of belonging. At several junctures in his theory, Rawls emphasizes the importance of people's search for belonging, which is something that often reaches beyond democratic membership. A religious quest for belonging connects human existence to a transcendent and eternal reality. By contrast, non-transcendent versions of the possibilities for belonging track the accomplishments of human society and indeed the value of humanity itself. Rawls describes the outer reaches of a secular search for human belonging in this way. To take up the conditions that are reasonable in our conduct with respect to one another would be, he says, to view the human situation not only from all social, but from all temporal points of view, which is, he says, not a perspective from a certain place beyond the world, nor the view of a transcendent being. Rather, it is a certain form of thought and feeling that rational persons can adopt within the world. He continues, such persons would, quote, whatever their generation, bring together into one scheme all individual perspectives and arrive together at regulative principles that can be affirmed by everyone as he lives by them, each from his own standpoint. This mode of normative thinking, as Rawls so beautifully describes it, is a form of impartiality that displays sensitivity to place and time. It is responsive to the variations in human experience across geography and history. I submit that the passage from A Theory of Justice that I've just quoted can be seen as a highly abstract way of describing the search for reconciliation between people who stand in unequal social positions. In other words, one way to describe Rawls's insight, though he does not put it this way, is to say that the circumstances of justice should be understood to include group-based harms that demand a remedy that will facilitate reconciliation between people whose relative social standing has been marred by injustice. I turn now to what Rawls refers to as the subjective circumstances of justice. As Rawls describes them, I'm behind my slide. As Rawls describes them, the subjective circumstances of justice comprise conflicts of interest that arise from people's limited knowledge, biased reasoning, selfish tendencies, and doctrinal differences, which span a diversity of philosophical, religious, social, and political views. I agree that these conflicts of interest are real and important, but they underdescribe the historically familiar subjective circumstances that demand a just remedy. I have in mind not simply ordinary biased judgment, selfish tendencies, and philosophical disagreements, but extraordinary efforts that groups of people have made to erect entire economies and social structures aimed at the exploitation of other human beings. I would also include the deliberate efforts that members of dominated and exploited groups have undertaken to resist their oppression. So, to sum up so far, we should recognize that the circumstances of justice include not only people's present needs, limited resources, self-concern, and conflicting beliefs, but also their shared history. The circumstances of justice should be understood to include a collective search for reconciliation in the aftermath of historical injustice, including war and other forms of organized violence. Though not all parties fought for the cause of justice, and not all have suffered equally, those who have been at war share an experience of hardship and a need for moral repair. There are some familiar obstacles to reconciliation. One obstacle is the sense of social dishonor and alienation experienced by people who have been oppressed. Martin Luther King described this as the bleakness of corroding despair. The internalization of oppression is an obstacle to the just demand for redress. King found that it must and could be overcome through collective action. The strategy he advocated was the practice of nonviolent direct action. It surpassed his expectations. King was astounded by the power of the Montgomery bus boycott to express its participants' newfound faith in themselves. The realization of a sense of self-worth through collective forms of political action unsettled the bleakness of corrosive despair with the demand for democratic equality. Collective political action is one strategy among other possibilities for countering the bleakness of corroding despair. A second obstacle to the achievement of a historically attentive sense of human belonging is found in the sense of loyalty that beneficiaries of historical injustice often feel to one another and to their ancestors, namely the socio-ancestral group that has perpetuated an injustice and from which its beneficiaries have benefited. This may lead to a distorted sense of history. For example, a Confederate monument in front of the Lafayette County Courthouse in Oxford, Mississippi reads, "In memory of the patriotism of the Confederate soldiers of Lafayette County, Mississippi. They gave their lives in a just and holy cause." The back panel reads, "The sons of veterans unite in this justification of their father's fate." There are many examples like this. And just to make sure everyone from Brazil understands, this is a monument celebrating the Confederate effort to secede from the Union in 1860 in order to maintain an economy based on slavery. Memorialization produces a dilemma for persons of conscience. It is a dilemma that involves choosing justice over loyalty. The difficulty lies in how to recalibrate loyalties while maintaining a sense of one's authenticity. How can one acknowledge the flaws and injustices of one's forebears as one's forebears while maintaining a sense of their connection to oneself? How can one memorialize them without embracing their injustice? It's tempting to abstract from the moral flaws in the thought and behavior of one's forebears and to focus instead on the better angels of their nature, to appeal, for example, to abstract principles of justice, equality, and freedom that might serve to link the past and present of a society's public political culture with the possibility of a better world. But this exercise in selection threatens to constitute an evasion of the historical specificity of how those principles were ignored, violated, misappropriated, and twisted into weapons of war and oppression. When Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, his philosophical position could not be squared with his political commitments. It simply could not be done. The universal rights and equality of all men were not compatible with the American institution of slavery. Democracy has always been understood by its practitioners as compatible, in fact, with the freedom of some to dominate others. This is the central argument in sociologist Orlando Patterson's important book on the history of the concept of freedom. The freedom to dominate, Patterson says, is one dimension of a tripartite Western concept of freedom that emerged under conditions of slavery. Philosophically celebrated notions of freedom from interference and the freedom of collective self-government have always been historically conjoined with a third aspect of freedom, the freedom of some to dominate others. Historical reckoning makes possible an authentic conversion from loyalty to justice. Reckoning with historical injustice includes an examination of democracy's contradictions and the various rationalizations, including ideas of racial hierarchy and other lies about inequality that have been used to obscure them. Here, I think Rawls can help us. The need to reckon with historical injustice presents an opening for us to learn from what Rawls taught us about how to think about justice. This is the seemingly simple yet deep truth Rawls presented to us creatively in the form of the original position thought experiment. It's possible for a person, any person, standing wherever that person is located in history and the social order, to shift perspectives. It's open to each of us to consider the social position, interests, and experience of other persons. The beneficiary of a profound injustice could take up the viewpoint of people who resisted the injustice and concede that they did so understandably and justly. This, in fact, unjustly privileged person might acknowledge the reasons for historical struggle and resistance and think, I might have done the same thing in your place, or I hope I would have done the same, or at least I understand why you fought the fight. This would allow such a person to find common ground with those who struggled against the oppressive forces that benefited a select undemocratic few, without requiring the privileged person to agree that he would have, had he been positioned as his ancestors were, relinquished his unjustly achieved privilege, or that he would give it up now. Reckoning with the past by considering the perspective of people who were wronged, how they felt and what they did in response to their unjust treatment, permits people to stand together without denying differences of social position. We can see clearly something that we know that the universal truth of certain ethical principles of justice and equality is compatible with the abuse of those principles. We also see that the history of resistance to injustice is a resource for all members of society. I've been describing the possibility of conversion from a familiar defense of some version of the status quo by the privileged to an imagined identification with people who have resisted injustice. This involves, I am suggesting, a projection of oneself into a possibly ongoing historical conflict in an effort to view the conflict from the perspective of persons who we know have been wronged. This imaginative exercise opens up the possibility of granting their claim to reparative justice. Rawls argued that the original position thought experiment brings us to the two principles of justice. The two principles of justice include, importantly, the demand for fair equality of opportunity. Fair equality of opportunity is the demand that those who are similarly motivated and talented should have equal chances of success in attaining their desired social positions. As Tommy Shelby has persuasively argued, fair equality of opportunity must be understood as sensitive to the variety of obstacles, including group-based favoritism and status inequalities that interfere with open positions. The unfortunate litany of historical wrongs shows us that fair equality of opportunity can be threatened in multiple ways. It is threatened not only by how the better off may leverage their wealth for further advantages, but also by how they may maintain their social standing by withholding important forms of recognition from other social groups. In other words, they may behave in ways that undermine equality in the social bases of self-respect. Interference with the social bases of self-respect also interferes with fair equality of opportunity, not only by directly undermining the openness of positions, but also by compromising the social support people normally rely on to develop their talents and motivation. An expanded understanding of the circumstances of justice brings into view the need to establish the social bases of self-respect, which can be so damaged by injustice. Rawls saw philosophy itself as a form of reconciliation, and here's an example of its possible resources. Philosophical reflection might lead us to the view, with hindsight, that those who have suffered wrongs have a claim to the forms of reparative justice that are needed to substantiate fair equality of opportunity. My extension of the Rawlsian thought experiment also permits us to view the principle of fair equality of opportunity in a new way, as a principle of social healing and reconciliation. In turn, this understanding of fair equality of opportunity sheds light on the underlying good of justice. An important aspect of the value of distributive justice is that it offers the possibility of reconciliation and healing in the aftermath of historical injustice. So I'm going to conclude with just a thought about the Rawlsian notion of a people. The idea of a people threatens to stand for a troublesome romantic notion that is highly subject to ideological distortion. But it's less troublesome when it's rooted in history, which incorporates multiple perspectives. The notion of a people that's rooted in history is not a romantic ideal, but a historical fact. It's a historical fact that must be confronted as a condition of hope for the future. All right, so I'm going to stop there and welcome comments and discussion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Kelly, for your very interesting talk. I think we'll have some questions. I'll start with the first one here on chat. Let me see. Okay, so from Bianca Camargo, she asks you, thank you so much for such a great lecture. Please consider the following question. Since violence and oppression are painful words in Western history, would you elaborate a bit more on the affirmative actions as way of reparation? Thanks again.
Sure. I mean, one way to think about affirmative action is as a policy, a measure that's intended to restore fair equality of opportunity, to incorporate marginalized people, especially racial minorities, but it's also been used, obviously, to benefit women, to elevate people who are marginalized such that they have opportunities that they've been historically excluded from. So if it is effective, and that's debatable as a strategy for improving fair equality of opportunity, and fair equality of opportunity is a way of achieving reconciliation as part of justice for repairing the past injustices and reconciling people who have been hurt or benefited from those injustices, then it could be viewed within the scope of reconciliation. But I think there's lots of room for debate about whether it's the best approach or an effective way to accomplish those goals. I'm not myself opposed to affirmative action, but I think it may accomplish less in the scope overall of reconciliation than we might want. I hope that answers the question. Bianca, if you have more thoughts on that, please follow up.
Okay, we have another question. Professor from Sam, why? Professor Kelly, this is a really daring topic. We all avoid it because of the difficulty in implementing ideas like yours. The questions that come to mind are, 1, how will you propose that competitive victimhood is handled in the quest for your idea of justice? This question is asked on the grounds that America and most Eurocentric societies are broken down along many demographic lines. The white poor are also victims of the institution of slavery, but would often be excluded from any form of restorative justice. 2, how will you suggest victims are classified in such a novel approach to social justice? And 3, where will hardworking people in marginalized groups be encouraged to work harder in such an approach to social justice? So you can just feel free to.
So one of the thoughts I'm trying to explore is what restorative justice would look like. What would it take to restore, if it ever existed, which it didn't, justice, or to repair, let's say reparative justice, to repair the harms of group-based oppression. And what I'm suggesting is that Rawls's principles of justice give us a kind of a roadmap. We would have to, accord everyone equal basic rights and liberties. We'd have to redistribute wealth and income by reorganizing, transforming the social structure so that it's more equitable. And we would have to take the measures that would be needed to underwrite fair equality of opportunity. So restorative justice is complex. It's not just picking out one group or another and sort of according them compensation for historical wrongs. It's, as I understand it, through the Rawlsian framework, kind of reorganizing the basic structure of society to realize justice. And what I'm adding is that is what it might take to reconcile historical injustice and to repair injuries from the past. So it's a very ambitious project. And if your question, Sam, is, well, what do we do first and who gets priority? I wasn't addressing that. I wasn't addressing that question. And not that it's not an interesting question. It is an interesting question. I mean, we could take the least well off first and try to improve their circumstances. That would be, you know, to follow a certain line of Rawlsian thought. But I recognize the problem of competitive victimhood and the kind of resentments that that can arise in that kind of incremental approach. I was interested in more of the overall structure of what justice would look like and how we might relate that to the goal of reconciliation between groups that have suffered or instigated or perpetuated historical injustice.
That's great. Professor Nitamar has a question, thanking you for your instigating talk and asking you, how do you bring together objective and subjective circumstances of justice in a society where social cooperation has been historically undermined because of violent processes of exclusion like slavery, racism, and authoritarianism?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was suggesting that we have to the scenario, the sort of societies that you're describing, and there are many of them, should lead us to expand our understanding of the objective and subjective circumstances of justice so that we think more about the nature of group-based conflicts, and how groups of people have exploited other groups or been exploited, and about the effects of that, the lasting effects of that over time, and that the important principles of justice that Rawls has offered to us make a lot of sense as responses, as rational responses to the need to address those enduring harms. So I wanted to think about the Rawlsian thought experiment kind of a lot more in historical context, although not only this history of one particular society, but of so many, really maybe all. So I'm not sure if that's a way of bringing together the objective and subjective circumstances. I think the objective and subjective circumstances fit together in the traditional picture, but are complicated by the way in which organized violence has often been a problem. And so I was trying to address that as a problem of justice that political philosophy can help us to think about the significance of.
Okay. And Professor Ken Baines also has a question. For Rawls, fair equality of opportunity will still leave in place inequalities that arise from natural talent. How would a more expansive view of justice move beyond that notion of meritocracy to a view of society in which all are equally respected, valued, and provided occasion for fulfilling life? In short, how do we address the challenge of the meritocratic ideal?
Well, Rawls resists the idea of a meritocracy in the following way. The inequalities that arise from natural talent are permissible only when the rewards for talent are to everyone's benefit, in particular, the benefit of those who are least well off. So that differs in structure from a meritocracy in which natural talent is rewarded as a matter of desert, regardless of whether those who don't receive the benefits are benefited by the way in which the rewards go toward talent. I think what I'm adding to the picture is that in thinking about the social effects on others, the costs and benefits of rewarding the talents of some, we should pay attention to the way in which those who have been rewarded might use their rewarded social position, not just by leveraging their wealth in order to benefit, their offspring, but the way in which they might use their social standing to stigmatize or exclude or marginalize others, to fail to recognize the equal social standing of other groups, and that a kind of attention to the requirements of the social bases of self-respect and what it takes to counter the dynamics of stigma when inequalities begin to emerge, even those that are beneficial to all, is something that's very important to do. And I think we've learned a lot from history about how stigma, how the dynamics of stigma work, and how hurtful they can be.
Thank you, Professor Kelly. Let's see in the chat if anybody else has more questions. Feel free to ask. Since no one, I have a space here, I'd like to just comment. I think it's really interesting how reconciliation has been coming up in literature from many viewpoints. And we have been talking, for example, yesterday we talked a little bit about how Rawls's theory can be a reconciliation still, in other terms, in the fact of pluralism, for example. And when Rawls talks in his lectures about reconciliation and the religious wars, he says a little bit about time, like it took 200 years for people to reconcile with toleration, so with this concept of toleration. So in your view, are we still, are we a little bit too anxious sometimes when I say when we are in these debates, we really can't see that we are still in this ongoing process, that it may take, I don't know how many time, but it's still important to understand that institutions, for example, to still focus on institutions and reforms in institutions is an important way to go to reconciliate.
Mm-hmm. I think that Rawls is right that that the possibility of reconciliation depends on people being tired of, certain tensions and inequalities in society, and the conflicts that those inequalities and forms of oppression might produce. So he's really directing our attention to sort of the impact of war and violence on people's willingness to consider change. And so when, if one lives in a society in which one isn't affected much by violence, it might seem like it's going to take a long time because the pressure isn't there. But I think that inequality, extreme inequality, like we have in the United States, isn't sustainable over time. There's going to be continuing social tension and fragmentation. And when people get tired of that, maybe they'll begin to think about what it's like to be on the losing end, those who are more privileged, and begin to think ethically in a little bit different way. And I just think Rawls's thought experiment of, it just sounds like I was saying, it sounds so simple in a way, like just take up the viewpoint of another person and think about their interests. And it's just so fundamental to ethical thought. And it's it's so intuitive in a way, but it's also something that people can really lose sight of as something that's important, in a materialistic competitive society. So, I don't know how optimistic to be about the possibilities for social change. I tend to think, as Rawls is suggesting, there has to be some serious forms of pressure and costs imposed on those who are benefiting from an inequality before there's a certain openness to reconsider it. But he's giving us at least a kind of ethical paradigm for reconsidering and exploring what kinds of social transformations would have to take place in order to, repair those harms between groups that are so enduring over time because of the ways in which they reproduce themselves through the social structure. So I wanted to appreciate some of the thinking that Rawls offered us, and to kind of apply it a little bit more broadly to some of the problems that we're facing and struggling with in our societies. I think the same is true of Brazil. The conflict and inequality and the social costs of that, not only to those who lose out, but to a sense of peace and well-being in society overall. To a collective sense of belonging to a good society. So I wanted to think about the good of justice. I wanted to think about, the ethical importance of taking up different perspectives, and to think about the possibility of doing that in a way that acknowledges the history of injustice and how it's been inherited and reproduced. So I don't know how fresh these ideas are. In a way, nothing is original here, but I'm just kind of reorganizing and emphasizing aspects of Rawls's thought that I think represent his contribution, and I think have sometimes become overlooked in the divide between the classification of Rawls as an ideal theorist and then people who care about injustice as falling into the camp of non-ideal theory, dealing with the real world. And I think we can think about a liberal political philosophy in a way that's engaged with those very serious problems of historical injustice and conflict that any person of conscience should be worried about.
Thank you, Professor Kelly. So we have another question here from Sarah Roberts-Cady. It seems right to point out that Rawls was insufficiently attentive to how group-based harms give rise to questions of justice. I take you to think that it is a sufficient condition for raising questions of justice, though not a necessary condition. Is that right? Does that make it at all different from the other circumstances of justice in Rawls's list, or do you think that they all function similarly?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I was thinking that Rawls wasn't thinking about the conditions, the circumstances of justice as all, strictly speaking, needing to be present in order for one to have a problem of justice, but that they're familiar, he calls them normal conditions under which problems of justice arise. Let me just go back to the subjective and objective conditions. Maybe we can think about that. Subjective circumstance of justice, limited knowledge. Okay, that's inevitable. Biased reasoning, that may be familiar, but maybe not always a necessary condition of justice. Selfish tendencies, doctrinal differences. I mean, these don't all seem like, strictly speaking, necessary conditions, but rather conditions that are familiar and frequent, and characterize what Rawls calls the normal circumstances. And then let's look at objective circumstances. Resource scarcity. Okay, that seems more necessary. If all the resources were so ample, that there was no need to cooperate and distribute them fairly because everyone had what they needed, then there would be no problem of justice. Rough quality of physical and mental powers. Well, I guess I don't know if that's a necessary condition of justice. Mutual vulnerability to attack, a certain sense of vulnerability, yes, maybe it's necessary. And the need to share territory, that seems necessary. So I think you're right, most of the conditions are necessary, but not all. And some of them are so I don't know, familiar and prevalent that a theory of justice should attend to them and help us to think about how justice would address and resolve the problems that flow from them. And I think the same is true of group-based harms and forms of oppression. So I don't think we should relegate that as a kind of a circumstance of justice that a theory of justice doesn't have to grapple with, because we could imagine some social circumstance in which group-based oppression is not exercised. I guess that's what I'd say. Not a very profound answer, but appreciate the question.
So we have time for one last question. So from Sam White. Okay, let's see. Where are important things like the family, high quality education? I'm sorry, a child must grow in a family that is stable, high quality education, and integration. Maybe these things at the bottom must be taken seriously, from Sam as well. So
yeah, I think those are all important factors from the perspective of justice. High quality education may be something people have a basic right to. We'd have to talk more about the nature of basic rights and how important the right to education is and what its scope is. But that seems potentially connected with Rawls's first principle of justice, which governs the equal basic rights and liberties. A child must grow in a family that's stable. I think that Rawls's view, and I would share this view, that the stability and health of the family is connected with the broader social circumstances of justice and fairness. If families need the support of the kind of resources and opportunities that Rawls's principles speak to. So the requirements of justice are to provide, healthcare, education, jobs, opportunities that enable not only individuals, but families to flourish in society. And that's what we owe one another. It doesn't mean that we owe one another, a guarantee of a stable family, but a reasonable opportunity for one's family to be healthy and to flourish. And health care and economic opportunities are factors that help to stabilize families, as well as education. Integration is something that, while it may not be strictly speaking a requirement of justice, would be a natural outcome of fair equality of opportunity and socioeconomic equality. I think that the racial segregation that we see in the United States and in other countries is the product of deliberate governmental efforts and social public cultural efforts to divide and marginalize minority groups, especially Black Americans. It didn't happen naturally. It will be corrected when the kinds of damaging policies that have helped to design racial segregation are fought against, and their effects repaired through counter policies.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Erin Kelly. I think that we all thought it was very interesting, your talk. And so thanks a lot for it.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm sorry, Professor Ken, he had another question. And I think that we still have a little bit of 5 minutes. Professor Paul Weithman has arrived. Good evening, Professor Paul Weithman. And we can please ask your question. I didn't see it. So yeah, I mean, we have like 5 minutes still. So yeah.
And we can't hear you.
No.
No.
I can hear a dog though.
Mine.
It's not working, Ken. Must be your mic.
Yeah, how about now?
Now,
Yeah.
now it's okay.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Sorry, it seems to keep going in and out. I just had one quick question, final question, Erin. I really enjoyed the presentation quite a bit, but the use you're making of the original position is much more expansive. It's really this sort of moral musical chairs, right? Put yourself in the position of another. But in Rawls, it had a more technical use as well that was more restricted. And one of the constraints was the assumption about society as a closed society. And so this raises the sort of question now about the southern border and so forth, and how in what you're proposing we might, from a kind of widened Rawlsian perspective, think about this topic, right? The Biden administration's now flying these Haitian immigrants, many of whom haven't been in Haiti for many, many years, directly back to Haiti. That wasn't really part of the original position and how to consider inequalities in his technical description of the original position, with this assumption that it's a closed society. I wonder if you have any thoughts about, right, if you take this other view of sort of moral musical chairs, and if we start to think about the history of oppression and so forth, the way you're describing, should modify or alter how we should be addressing the fate of others, which, right, seems to be, right, not of their choice, but of a function of their circumstance.
Yeah, I wasn't really addressing those questions of immigration or assuming that the original position should be stretched in a way that, included representatives of groups to settle from different countries to settle questions about immigration. That's a further topic, and that it may or may not be a helpful way to resolve those questions. One of the alternatives is the law of people's approach, where there's a wider original position thought experiment used, but rather than representatives of individuals or groups, we have representatives of different societies. So I'd have to think more, about what difference it would make, and also how the history of injustice between societies should be represented in normative reasoning about what one country owes to another country or to groups of people in other countries. I do think it's relevant from a human rights perspective. if their injuries were caused by one's country. But that's a further conversation. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Professor Baines, Professor Kelly, and good evening, Professor Paul Weithman. We are very happy to have you in our symposium. We are entering the third panel of the day. It's night already in Brazil, 8 o'clock. So I'll be Professor Paul Weithman, for us who study roles, right? We would need to introduce him, but I still, even so, I think it's also very nice also to introduce people. So Professor Paul Weithman is a professor in the Department of Philosophy of Notre Dame. He earned his master's and PhD in philosophy at Harvard, where he wrote his doctoral dissertation under the direction of John Rawls and Judith Scarp. Professor Weithman works primarily in political philosophy and its history. His most recent book is Rawls, Political Liberalism and Reasonable Faith. His book, Why Political Liberalism, won David and Elaine Spitz Prize for Best Book on Liberal Democratic Theory, published in 2010. Tonight, he'll talk about, in Public Reason, a Jack Trump's diversity. So the floor is open. Thank you very much for being here with us tonight in Brazil.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person, much as I would like to be. And I'll have to make this do until such time as I can come to see you. My talk goes about 45 minutes, so I won't spend too much time on warm up. I did have just a small handout that at some point it would be nice to screen share. I'll need privileges to do that, I think. It's not essential that I be able to do it, but the audience might appreciate it. So if I can have the privilege of sharing screen when the time comes, that would be great. Thank you very much. And with that, I'll get started. This paper is a response to a recently published one by Kevin Vallier and Ryan Muldoon, in which they argue that an important project in political philosophy that they call the Public Reason Project has recently split into two projects that differ in their fundamental assumptions. These are the Coherence and the Diversity projects, named for the views of political philosophy out of which they grow. Vallier and Muldoon argued that the coherence view is supported by a circular argument and fails at central tasks of political philosophy, and that their own diversity view is superior. I introduce a variant of the coherence view that I contend escapes their objections to that approach, and I question the independence of the diversity approach from the variant that I introduce. Muldoon and Vallier say that what they call the Public Reason Project was initiated by John Rawls and others 25 years ago. They don't say exactly what the Public Reason Project was or how Rawls helped to initiate it, but I believe their idea is this. Rawls's Political Liberalism, published roughly 25 years ago, included an essay called The Idea of Public Reason. In that essay, Rawls initiated, or gave considerable impetus to, a debate about what considerations could be used to justify laws and policies. He argued that those which bear on constitutional essentials and matters of basic justice had to be supported by what he called public reasons. Other philosophers disagreed. Because Rawls's treatment helped to set the terms of the debate, the project of identifying justifying reasons for laws and policies came to be called the Public Reason Project. That is the project that Vallier and Muldoon contend has split into two projects which are fundamentally different. Rawls himself famously defended different guidelines of public reason at different times, but he consistently held that justifying reasons are those which show that laws and policies bearing on fundamental questions are justifiable to members of society in their public role, their role as citizens. Citizens have the capacity for conceptions of the good, but considered just as such, they do not have any particular conceptions. To identify reasons which can be used to show laws and policies acceptable to citizens as such is therefore to identify reasons which can show them acceptable to citizens just as free and equal, hence acceptable to them regardless of the conceptions of the good they hold. Rawls explicitly introduced the idea of public reason only in his later writings, but his attempt to identify those reasons is continuous with the fundamental commitments of a theory of justice. For there, Rawls argued that his two principles were acceptable to us as free equals. An account of public reason shows how their applications can be as well. That's why an embryonic account of public reason appears avant la lettre in theory of justice. Now, the phrase public reason can have many meanings. Other philosophers are free to use it differently than Rawls did. But to say that Rawls's treatment of public reason helped to initiate what was once a single public reason project misleads, for it obscures the fact that many of those who disagreed with Rawls about public justification were, from the outset, engaged in the enterprise of identifying reasons which could show laws and policies acceptable to citizens conceived very differently than Rawls conceived them. The philosophers I have in mind were interested in justifying exercises of power to citizens conceived of as committed to some definite conception of the good. Justification to citizens so conceived had to show laws and policies acceptable in light, and perhaps in terms of, those conceptions. From the Rawlsian point of view, the alternative accounts that they developed were not accounts of justification to citizens in their public role. They were not accounts of public reason at all. Labeling the non-Rawlsian accounts as accounts of public reason thus fosters the illusion that alternatives were once much closer to Rawlsian aspiration than they in fact were. It makes it possible to contend, as Valliere and Muldoon do, that what they call the divergence within the public reason literature emerged only recently. It's not misleading to suggest that the approaches which they say diverge are approaches to a single project despite long-standing foundational differences. But confusion about the similarity of approaches and aims might be averted if the project were called the Public Justification Project instead. Or if we follow Jeremy Waldron in thinking that a commitment to rational justifiability of all aspects of the social is definitive to liberalism, then we can simply call the project the Liberal Project. The capaciousness of the term liberal makes this label appropriate, since it reminds us of how wide a range of political philosophers, including classical liberals, have engaged in the project. And that's how I'll refer to it. Well, Valliere and Muldoon distinguish two views of public justification. One is the coherence view, and that view, they say, sees the public reason project as attempting to show that the key concepts in political liberalism are a conceptually coherent unit. It offers a model of citizens whose conceptions of justice and conceptions of the good are in alignment, but does this by stipulating away a more realistically diverse population, unquote. The other is the diversity view. That is the other view of public justification. That view, quote, expressly argues that respecting real-world pluralism requires liberal institutions. The coherence view idealizes away from pluralism to focus on the relations between liberal ideas. The diversity view embraces that pluralism to show how pluralism and liberalism can mutually reinforce one another, unquote. Now, these views are said to grow out of two responses to a tension in Rawls between two kinds of justification that Rawls says a political conception of justice can enjoy: pro tanto justification and full justification. According to Rawls, a conception is pro tanto justified if its political values alone give a reasonable answer by public reason to all or nearly all questions concerning constitutional essentials and basic justice. A conception is fully justified when each citizen accepts a political conception and embeds it in some way into that citizen's comprehensive doctrine. Now, Valliere and Muldoon say that the distinction between pro tanto and full justification opens the possibility that some putatively reasonable citizens might not embed the political conception into their comprehensive doctrines because of a conflict between the two. In that case, the conception would be pro tanto, but not fully justified. This possibility prompts two responses. The response associated with the diversity approach allows that reasonable persons can reject all liberal political conceptions of justice, hence those that are pro tanto justified, but argues that liberal institutions may yet be justified to a public deeply divided over justice and the good. The coherence view responds by saying that a reasonable person, by definition, will accept any reasonable political conception of justice, and hence any conception that's pro tanto justified. It therefore forecloses the possibility of divergence by stipulation. Now, Valliere and Muldoon do not claim that these are the only possible responses to the tension. And I shall now sketch a third one, which leads to a third approach to the liberal project. I take the response and the approach to be Rawls's. I draw on his texts to explain them and refer to them tendentiously as the Rawlsian response and the Rawlsian approach. But I'm less concerned with Rawls' exegesis than with spelling out an alternative to the coherence and diversity approaches. And so I shall not worry if the response and approach I sketch are less Rawlsian than I suppose. To see the Rawlsian response, recall that Rawls said the justice of a well-ordered society is stabilized by an overlapping consensus on a family of liberal political conceptions. Such a consensus can obtain only if reasonable citizens endorse one or another of those conceptions. They will do that only if the conceptions they endorse enjoy three kinds of justification, two of which are pro tanto and full. So if a just society is to be stable, each reasonable conception must hold that at least one conception of justice enjoys both kinds. But the Rawlsian view does not stipulate divergence away. The convergence of pro tanto and full justification, introduced to explain how an overlapping consensus is possible, is itself explained by what Rawls calls reasonable moral psychology. Liberal political conceptions of justice share certain essential features. Citizens see that a basic structure which satisfies one such conception institutionalizes those features and so satisfies principles of mutual benefit. Seeing that arrangements work for mutual benefit and so work for their benefit, they reciprocate by supporting just institutions and affirming the essentials of liberal political conceptions. The connection between reasonability and reciprocity becomes apparent when we recall the third kind of justification that Rawls introduces into his account of stability, but which Valliere and Muldoon fail to mention: public justification by political society. Rawls writes, I quote, "Public justification happens when all the reasonable members of society carry out a justification of the shared political conception by embedding it in their several reasonable comprehensive views. In this case, reasonable citizens take one another into account as having reasonable comprehensive doctrines that endorse that conception." Now, this passage was written as if an overlapping consensus obtains on a single shared political conception rather than on a family. But I take it to imply that the family enjoys public justification when each citizen has some fully justified conception, and this fact is common knowledge. I also take it to suggest a route to full justification. Some citizens might embed their political conceptions in their views of the good because they see that others do. That is, some citizens might embed a political conception in their views of the good in response to what they know of the behavior of others. The passage I just quoted might be thought to suggest that citizens who are independently identified as reasonable will respond this way. But according to the Rawlsian approach, responsiveness to others is not independent of reasonability. Rather, the disposition to this form of reciprocity is a condition of reasonability. Thus, like the first two responses, the Rawlsian response depends upon claims about who reasonable persons are and what they might do. It differs from the coherence response in denying that reasonable citizens are defined as those who accept reasonable or pro tanto justified conceptions of justice. Rather, it makes reasonability dependent upon dispositions which explain why a citizen of a well-ordered society would accept the essentials of a liberal conception of justice. It differs from the diversity response in denying that citizens who are putatively reasonable in the actual world are ipso facto reasonable in the sense of reasonable relevance to justification. It holds instead that unless we know how someone would respond to just institutions and to others who are ready to treat her justly, we can't know whether she is reasonable or not. The Rawlsian approach to the liberal project differs from the coherence approach in how it understands reasonability. But it shares with the coherence approach the feature that leads Valliere and Muldoon to label that approach as they do. For the Rawlsian approach attempts to show how it's possible for citizens to live as free equals while keeping their society stably just for the right reasons. It therefore attempts to show how core liberal values can be realized together over time. Showing that this is possible shows conceptual coherence. Valliere and Muldoon offer a number of objections to the coherence approach. Because of its affinities with that approach, the Rawlsian approach may be thought subject to the same objections. I now want to argue that the Rawlsian approach can avoid three of the most potent. One, that the approach is too abstract to be action guiding. Second, that it relies on a circular argument. And third, that it's outperformed by the diversity approach in tasks Rawls assigned to political philosophy. First, the objection that it's inadequately action guiding. Valliere and Muldoon worry that because of its focus on ideal theory, the coherence view is inadequately action guiding with respect to important political problems, at least in comparison with the diversity view. Indeed, they say that focus marks a retreat from a core project of political philosophy. The coherence approach is of a piece with a political theory that's entirely insulated, they say, from standard concerns of political philosophy, namely the challenge of how we choose shared rules for governing ourselves in the face of deep disagreement, unquote. Now, whether this criticism has bite against the Rawlsian approach or the coherence approach depends upon whether the challenge that Muldoon and Valliere identify is, as they imply, one political theory can be expected to take up. That challenge is not obviously front and center in Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Politics, Aquinas' Treatise on Law, Moore's Utopia, Rousseau's Second Discourse, Marx's Das Kapital, Nozick's Anarchy, State and Utopia, or Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism. That is not strikes me as a reductio, both of Valliere and Muldoon's claim that that challenge is a standard one, and of their clear implication that addressing the challenge is a standard against which bodies of political thought should be judged. The task of offering guidance for resolving real political disputes is important, but it is just one task political philosophy might legitimately be expected to shoulder. Neither the Rawlsian nor the coherence approaches should be criticized simply because they failed to take up the task. What matters is whether the task they do take up is important. Now, Valliere and Muldoon concede that the coherence approach does aim to answer a number of important questions, but the tone in which they describe the question that gives the view its name suggests that they think that question is not an important one. Thus, they write, the term coherence denotes shared commitment to showing that the fundamental commitments of political liberalism, especially the ideas of society as a system of fair cooperation and persons as reasonable and rational equals, all fit together. The goal is to show that there is no essential tension between them, and that is all. I worry that Valliere and Muldoon underestimate the importance, including the practical importance, of establishing the coherence of liberal ideals. The political cultures of liberal democracies, including their founding documents, encourage citizens to think of themselves in certain ways and to entertain certain desires and hopes for their political relations. They encourage citizens to think of themselves as free equals. They encourage citizens' desire to live together as free equals, and they foster citizens' hopes that they can do so. Though this contention would be hard to prove without more historical argument than space allows, I believe the hope that liberal democracy can make good on its promise has been important in sustaining citizens' commitment to that form of government. It seems to follow from conceptual truths about hope that hope in liberal democracy depends upon the beliefs that its object, a society in which citizens live as free equals, is attainable and attractive. Liberal democracy would be attainable if the ideals of freedom and equality that it promises simultaneously to realize are in fact incompatible. Many of the political disputes that divide contemporary liberal democracy suggest that they are, since they turn on putative conflicts of liberty and equality. Moreover, we live at a moment in which faith in liberal democracy's ability to deliver on its promise is under sustained assault by geopolitical rivals who want to demonstrate the superiority of authoritarian or one-party rule. The claim that liberal democracy is coherent and appealing is in urgent need of vindication. The Rawlsian approach to the liberal project, like the coherence approach, addresses that urgent need. Second objection is the circularity problem. And it's in this connection that I wanted to share the handout. I emailed it, and if someone else could screen share it, that would be great. If I need to screen share it, I can. I hope. We'll see. Oh, thank you. That's very helpful. I appreciate somebody else doing that. Sorry, I've lost my paper just a moment. There we are. Okay, the circularity argument. Valliere and Muldoon say that the coherence approach has a circular feel, is circular and stipulative, and seems circular, indeed dangerously so. The circularity problem is said to arise in connection with the possibility, discussed above, that reasonable persons will reject liberal political conceptions of justice. Valliere and Muldoon take the coherence approach to foreclose that possibility by asserting the definitional truth of what I've called 1C, reasonable persons endorse liberal political conceptions of justice, and inferring, CC, it's not possible for reasonable persons to reject liberal political conceptions. This argument is not circular, since the set of premises, the singleton 1C, does not include the conclusion. Nor, I think, is Valliere and Muldoon's objection just that the coherence approach defines reasonability at 1C so that CC follows immediately, and the troubling possibility that I raised earlier can't arise. Rather, I conjecture that Valliere and Muldoon object to the argument because they find 1C implausible. They find it implausible because they think it prima facie plausible that some people who are putatively reasonable are unqualifiedly reasonable, and that such people might reject liberal political conceptions of justice. But, they think, proponents of the coherence approach do not rebut the prima facie plausibility claim. They simply postulate that anyone who rejects all liberal political conceptions is unreasonable. That, I think, is the real ground of Valliere and Muldoon's objection. Thus, the problem Valliere and Muldoon see in the coherence theorists' argument is not one of circularity or of some other inferential fallacy. It's that 1C is inadequately supported. Perhaps what Valliere and Muldoon think gives the argument a circular feel is this. They find the denial of 1C so plausible that they think the only way the coherence theorist could endorse it is by endorsing CC, the conclusion that 1C is adduced to support. Now, if this analysis of the circularity objection is right, then the Rawlsian approach avoids it. For the proponent of the Rawlsian approach responds to the troubling possibility with a different argument, the second argument on the handout, which goes roughly as follows. Citizens are reasonable only if they reciprocate when living under institutions that satisfy principles of mutual benefit. Principles of mutual benefit are given by liberal political conceptions of justice. So citizens are reasonable only if they reciprocate when living under institutions that satisfy a liberal political conception. Citizens who reciprocate when living under institutions that satisfy such a conception accept its essentials. So citizens are reasonable only if, when living under institutions that satisfy a liberal political conception of justice, they accept the essentials of that conception. In a well-ordered society, institutions satisfy a liberal political conception of justice. And so in a well-ordered society, liberal citizens accept the essentials of liberal political conceptions of justice. Now, Valliere and Muldoon do not say why they think it possible that a reasonable person could reject all liberal political conceptions. I assume this would happen only if she objected to what makes a conception liberal and political. That is, only if she objected to the essentials of such a conception. But the conclusion of this second argument that I just laid out implies that this wouldn't happen in a well-ordered society. This response to the troubling possibility that I raised above, that Valliere and Muldoon raised above, isn't circular, and nor is it subject to the real objection to the response by the coherence approach, namely the unsupported assertion of 1c. For instead of relying on the definition of reasonable asserted in 1c, it relies on one of the conditions of reasonability identified earlier, a disposition to reciprocate to institutions which satisfy principles of mutual benefit. Now, as we saw, Valliere and Muldoon object to 1c because it deems unreasonable, putatively reasonable persons who reject liberal political conceptions of justice. The people they have in mind are seemingly reasonable persons who reject such conceptions in our world. As 1r implies, however, the Rawlsian approach conditions judgments of reasonability on the presence of institutions which satisfy the demands of reciprocity as that approach understands them. Institutions in our world fail to satisfy those demands. So the Rawlsian approach does not deem persons Valliere and Muldoon have in mind unreasonable by definition, and the approach avoids their objection. Neither does that approach declare that people who seem unreasonable in our world are unreasonable, for we do not know how those people would respond to the institutions of a well-ordered society. On the question of who in our world is unreasonable, the Rawlsian approach remains largely agnostic. We shall see that its agnosticism is advantageous. Well, the Rawlsian approach's reliance on 1r may insulate it from Valliere and Muldoon's objections to the coherence approach's argument for CC, but it seems to play into their charge that the Rawlsian approach, like the coherence approach, abstracts too much from our world to be useful. Is there some principled reason, then, for conditioning reasonability judgments on the presence of just institutions? Well, one is that reasonability, like public reason and other concepts in the Rawlsian repertoire, is introduced as part of ideal theory. This response is, however, unlikely to satisfy those like Valliere and Muldoon, who object that the Rawlsian approach is too idealized. But fortunately, the proponent of that approach has another response. That is that the quality of reasonability is acquired and can be reinforced or thwarted through lived experience. How moral development proceeds and what ideas of justice someone endorses depend on the institutions under which she lives. Someone who lives under institutions which violate demands of mutual benefit may not be well positioned to appreciate a conception of justice which articulates those demands, particularly if she has false beliefs about who benefits from the institutions she lives under. If, for example, she falsely believes that welfare benefits in her society are generous and that those less advantaged than she are advanced in preference to her, she may reject an egalitarian conception of justice that she would endorse if she experienced its implications. On the other hand, someone who knows she lives under institutions that are mutually beneficial is positioned to see how she benefits from them. And it is the knowledge that she benefits which triggers the response to which 1r refers. Because the Rawlsian approach conditions reasonability judgments on institutional conditions and remains agnostic about the unreasonability of citizens in our world, it encourages us to doubt our tendency to dismiss our political antagonists as unreasonable. And it encourages us to ask why those who seem unreasonable have the views they do. These upshots of the Rawlsian approach enable it to handle another criticism that Valliere and Muldoon aim at the coherence approach. Valliere and Muldoon contend that the diversity approach outperforms the coherence approach with respect to tasks of political philosophy that Rawls himself identifies. I shall focus here on the task to which they themselves give the most attention, that of reconciliation. This is a very important task, especially in societies in which divisions are as rancorous and paralyzing as they are in the contemporary US. Valliere's and Muldoon's challenge to the coherence approach is worth quoting at length. Quote, "Political philosophy," Rawls says, "may try to calm our frustration and rage against our society and its history by showing us the way in which its institutions are rational and developed over time as they did to attain their present rational form. The coherence view can help with reconciliation, especially since Rawls says that the ideas of a fair system of cooperation over time and of persons as free and equal citizens can help to convince citizens that they are indeed free and equal if the basic structure of society embodies those ideals. But what if reconciliation in our society is far off due to frustration and rage among people with highly diverse perspectives, including perspectives about justice? How can the coherence view play a reconciling role? It rules out many views as unreasonable, and so cannot propose reconciliation between those views and other members of society. Unquote. The critique begins with the possibility that reconciliation in our society is far off because people have very different ideas about justice. The Rawlsian approach encourages us to ask why reconciliation is far off. As I mentioned above, the founding documents and political cultures of liberal democracies encourage citizens to think of themselves as free equals entitled to live as such. It is because that view of citizens is part of liberal democratic culture that Rawls's well-ordered society would, as Valliere and Muldoon put it, help to convince citizens that they are indeed free and equal, unquote. But if institutions fail to live up to their promise, that is, if they fail to provide conditions in which citizens can live as they are encouraged to think they can, then actuality's shortfall from citizens' legitimate expectations may itself be the reason reconciliation is so far off. This is precisely the sort of explanation of social division for which the Rawlsian approach encourages us to look. So the Rawlsian approach provides useful guidance in our attempts to understand social divisions. Now, Valliere and Muldoon object that the coherence approach cannot affect or guide reconciliation in a society deeply divided about questions of justice. One reason they think it cannot, in addition to its abstractness, is that the coherence approach is committed to what they call an internal conception of political justification. According to this conception, justification need only be offered to reasonable citizens. This claim about the scope of justification, when conjoined with 1c, commits the coherence approach to the conclusion that the subjects of justification are just those who affirm liberal values and have given them deliberative priority over comprehensive conceptions. Proponents of the coherence approach see no need to offer justification to those who reject liberal conceptions. But, Valliere and Muldoon imply, those who reject liberal political conceptions may bulk large among those whom reconciliation is needed. Does this objection defeat the Rawlsian approach? Well, we have seen that on the Rawlsian approach, reasonability is encouraged by the forces of social learning at work in a just society. If those forces would successfully encourage everyone in a just society to be reasonable in the sense of 1R, then even if justification in a just society need only be offered to the reasonable, the scope of justification would be the entire citizenry. The distinction between internal and external conceptions of justification would then have no place in a Rawlsian approach, for it would not apply to the case the approach was developed to handle. We've also seen that because 1R takes the place of 1C in the Rawlsian approach, that approach is agnostic about the unreasonability of citizens in our world, including those who reject liberal political views. The principle of charity demands that we treat as reasonable those about whose reasonability we are unsure. So even if the Rawlsian approach endorses the claim that justification need only be offered to those we take to be reasonable, it does not objectionably narrow the scope of justification in the actual world in the way that Valliere and Muldoon claim the coherence approach does. Those who act on the Rawlsian approach will bring to political discussion first principles of justice they want to implement. They will think their political opponents could accept those principles, since the principles are acceptable to citizens understood as free and equal. But they will know their opponents may actually reject the principles they want to implement. If they appeal to first principles in political justifications they offer for reasons that implement them, or for measures that implement them, Some of their fellow citizens may reject that part of their justifications. But there are several reasons why disagreement at the level of political first principles is compatible with far less rancor and distrust than prevails in the contemporary US. Since I cannot analyze the causes of partisan division, I mention these reasons only briefly. One is that those who disagree at the deepest level do not dismiss one another as unreasonable. If those who disagree at the deepest level do not dismiss one another as unreasonable, they will not regard one another as impervious to reason or as not worth thoughtful political engagement. Parties who engage one another despite deep disagreement can and should treat one another with courtesy and with moral and intellectual seriousness. And they can and should resist the lure of political actors and media figures who advance their own fortunes by demonizing opponents and characterizing their positions. Refusing to dismiss one's opponents as unreasonable generally requires repudiating officials and commentators who encourage us to see them that way. Another is that those who bring contentious first principles to politics may find that they and their opponents can reach agreement on mid-level principles and on political solutions that follow from them. Even if they cannot, they may be able to agree on measures giving all sides less than each wants. Reaching such agreement requires negotiation, and negotiation requires mutually recognized willingness to compromise and search for common ground. This mutual recognition can be at least a temporary basis of trust. Third, the value of reciprocity is central to the Rawlsian approach to the liberal project. Those who follow that approach should manifest their commitment to reciprocity, not just in their willingness to engage others respectfully and to meet them halfway, but also in the substance of their political proposals. In recent decades, the benefits of economic growth have gone disproportionately to the best off, while some among the working class and the working poor think that the worst off are being advanced at their expense. Under these conditions, those committed to reciprocity should work with their opponents on the passage of political measures that can be seen to benefit all. This might include giving priority to public goods, which are by definition non-excludable. Agreement might also be found on measures that proponents of the diversity approach, such as Valliere and Muldoon, say that they favor. Finally, a principal cause of divisiveness, at least in the US, is one I believe frustrates both the diversity and the Rawlsian approaches. That is the political participation of those who reject established ways of ascertaining truth, such as the methods of climate science and epidemiology, or who seem to attach less weight to truth than to partisan loyalty. Their political opponents may be strongly tempted to dismiss them as unworthy of argumentative engagement. The Rawlsian approach directs us to understand why some citizens take these stances, but I confess it has little to say about how to engage them. I suspect, though, that the diversity approach fares no better. Well, I have argued that the Rawlsian approach to the liberal project takes up a question, the importance of which Valliere and Muldoon underestimate, that it can answer some of the most important objections they make to the coherence approach, and that it's compatible with mutual trust and civility. I recognize that development of the diversity view has greatly enriched contemporary political philosophy, illuminating important questions of long-standing interest and bringing new ones to light. Is one of these two approaches to the liberal project preferable to the other? Well, Valliere and Muldoon think that one of the reasons the diversity approach delivers results they consider superior is its methodology. They write, quote, "We believe that political philosophers can best make progress by making use of tools and lessons of social science," unquote. And they observe that the diversity approach uses a more extensive set of tools than the coherence approach does, including formal models drawn from social choice theory, game theory, and evolutionary theory. Whether the use of these tools yields an approach that is superior to the Rawlsian one, or an interesting and fruitful variant of it, depends upon whether the fruits of that approach can be harvested without relying, at crucial points, on assumptions more characteristic of the Rawlsian than the diversity approach. Elsewhere, I've argued that an especially sophisticated account of justice that draws heavily on the tools Valliere and Muldoon commend depends upon Rawlsian assumptions. I close by suggesting that the diversity approach of Valliere and Muldoon does the same. After more than 2 decades of work, the diversity approach is highly developed. I can't consider its many nuances and variants here, but as presented in the essay Diversity Trumps Coherence by Valliere and Muldoon, it eschews the a priori philosophical arguments for first principles characteristic of the Rawlsian approach. Instead, it begins with a heterogeneous citizenry, idealized only slightly, and draws on the methods of social science to see what measures can be accepted by all its members in light of information about their views of justice and the good. Measures that can be accepted are justified. If Valliere and Muldoon's test of justification is emergence from the diversity approach, then consistency seems to demand that they not have preferences against which they measure the outcomes of that approach. But this seems not to be the case. At the end of their essay, Valliere and Muldoon consider the objection that their approach to justification is not guaranteed to yield liberal outcomes. In response, they say that they will bite the bullet. They commend the diversity approach for providing an attractive case for liberal institutions, even while conceding that the approach may stick them with weird and problematic, which I take to be non-liberal views. If Valliere and Muldoon regard their inability to guarantee liberal outcomes as a bullet to be bitten, and if they think their ability to offer an attractive case for liberal institutions is a merit of their approach, it must be because they have a preference for liberal outcomes in institutions. And as if to confirm this, they imply that the desirability of liberal outcomes is among our convictions. The question is how these convictions can be justified. Valliere and Muldoon make no attempt to justify them or to say how they could be justified. They simply assume the superiority of liberal institutions is among our considered judgments. The Rawlsian approach, as developed by Rawls, does attempt to account for our considered judgments of justice. It offers an account of which Valliere and Muldoon could avail themselves. But if they were to do so, they could not show the diversity approach superior to the Rawlsian one. Instead, they would, in effect, acknowledge that the diversity approach depends upon it for defense of its own foundational commitments. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Weithman, for your very interesting talk and paper. So now we're open to questions. So if anybody has a question, you can open your mic as well, or okay, Nitamar has one. So Professor Nitamar is asking you, thanking you for your brilliant paper and questioning. You have argued that stability for the right reasons is generated by the use of public reasons, and that this was actually Rawls' own view. How would you respond to the objection that public reasons are inadequate assurance mechanisms due to the problems associated with cheap talk and bad information that will be present even in a well-ordered society?
So that's a very difficult question, and an interesting one. Why do we think that they will be, if I may ask, why do we think that those will be present in a well-ordered society? I mean, I'm assuming that people in a well-ordered society will satisfy not just the constraints of public reason stipulating the reasons to which they will respond, but also satisfy some kind of a sincerity condition, that they'll be sincere in their profession of public reasons, and the commitment to a sincerity condition is itself widely known.
Right. I was thinking especially of politicians and lobbies, etc.
Yeah, there's a lot of cheap talk in politics, isn't there? Then I think a commitment to public reason on this is very helpful. A commitment to public reason on citizens' part does require them I think, to constrain the reason to which they themselves appeal, according to the Rawlsian proviso. It requires compliance with some kind of a sincerity condition. It also requires, I think, a willingness to call politicians to account for their cheap talk, and to acquire a certain sensitivity to it. When cheap talk is not going to be banished entirely from politics, but it is, I think, important that citizens hold politicians to account and demand that politicians themselves reason publicly and sincerely about the demands of justice and the common good. And insofar as they are in a position to repudiate those or criticize those who don't. So all of which is to say that it's very easy to take public reason and its requirements narrowly, and I'm sure I have written things that encourage that. That encourage us to think of public reason just as consisting in the requirement that one appeal to certain sorts of reasons and not others. But if we take public reason more broadly to include sincerity commitments, disposition to scrutinize the discourse of politicians, to repudiate or criticize politicians who themselves seem not to follow dictates of public reason, or to reason insincerely. If we understand public reason in that broad sense, as I think we must, then I think it will conduce to stability much more clearly than public reason construed narrowly would. So thanks for forcing that clarification. It's a very important one.
Okay, now we have a question from Professor Erin Kelly. She asks, Paul, is it your view that reciprocity requires not only sharing the benefits of social cooperation, but sharing the reasons to cooperate? And this means caring about how each person differently justifies political values in relation to their comprehensive doctrine. Is this what you are arguing? Are we required by justice to consider justification in this way from all points of view?
That's an interesting question. I suppose that requiring us to care about how each person differently justifies political values in their relation to comprehensive doctrine would be an extremely demanding requirement. I guess I think that how people compare or how people go about embedding conceptions of justice and comprehensive doctrines is something in which we should take some interest if circumstances seem to require it, if there seem to be comprehensive doctrines in society which raise questions about their compatibility with a liberal political conception, then I suppose it's natural for citizens to take an interest in how the two fit together. But I also think that quite often the question of how the two fit together demands an answer that might be quite sophisticated. And it might require a lot of study to understand how the two fit together. How a complex religious view with the developed theology might support a liberal political conception might itself be a complicated matter, and requiring citizens to delve into that, I think would be asking a great deal of them. But I'm not sure if that gets at what really motivated the question. I mean, I think for full justification in political society, that the political conception fits with others' conception, fits with everyone's conception of justice is supposed to be common knowledge. How exactly the fit comes about might, because of its complications, be too much for everyone to consider.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here on chat. So from Sam, why? It seems that the two authors you are critiquing provided a simplistic but straightforward way of distributing public resources. This probably works in many situations. So the question is, what mechanism can you propose that would capture different groups of people who might not fall into the categories presented by the two scholars you are critiquing? Do you have a framework that can integrate different views and ideas in distributing public good?
So I take it that the two categories presented by the scholars I'm critiquing are those who fall into the divergence view like themselves, and those who fall into the coherence view. And I think that they believe the coherence view is Rawls's view. And so I was at pains to develop an alternative and label it the Rawlsian view to make clear that I don't think the coherence view, as they sketch it, is Rawls's, and that Rawls's is more sophisticated. And so I think one category that captures those who, as it were, fall between the stools set up by Valliere and Muldoon. One category is the Rawlsian, the category of Rawlsians. And I guess I'd like to think that the Rawlsian framework can integrate different views and ideas about how public goods are to be distributed. Yeah, Ken has a question, I think.
Yes. So Professor Ken Baines, following up on Erin's question, at least as I understood it, how open is the notion of responsiveness, reciprocity? If we need to be responsive only to reasonable views, we fall back into the coherence view. If it is not so constrained, how open is it?
So the coherence view, as Valliere and Muldoon develop it, holds that people are reasonable if they hold that people are reasonable or a necessary condition of reasonability is willingness to accept a liberal political conception. And Valliere and Muldoon worry about this understanding of reasonability because they think there are lots of putatively reasonable people in our world who reject liberalism or reject Rawlsian liberalism or egalitarian liberalism. But they think the coherence view refuses to engage such putatively reasonable people. The way I understand things, reasonability is to be understood broadly. It doesn't have as a necessary condition that one accept, say, egalitarian liberalism in our world. Rather, I'm prepared to think that lots of people who might look unreasonable should be given the benefit of the doubt, because reasonability is to be understood not with respect to what you accept or don't accept in this world, but what you accept or wouldn't accept when living under just institutions. And so my view is that we ought to give people the benefit of the doubt who seem unreasonable, be open to engaging them. When we engage them, and this gets back to Erin's question, try to find out the deep reasons for thinking what they do and find out if they're liberal, if it's their comprehensive conception of the good that leads them to accept liberal or reject liberal solutions in our world. But I'm for giving just about everybody the benefit of the doubt, thinking that they should be engaged, treated courteously and with intellectual seriousness. And it's, in this case, the agnosticism about who's reasonable and who isn't in our world that makes such openness possible.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, since I didn't have time to write, I would just maybe a question regarding these two projects and how can we actually engage when, for example, you see Valliere when he talks about reconciliation in his book, what's the name, Liberal Politics and Public Faith. He says that the aim of his book is to reconcile liberal and religious citizens. That's it. And when we talk about reconciliation in the Rawlsian framework, you're talking about much more, I think, when you're putting it, the issue of the political world and the social world. So sometimes when I read these debates, I am very, I don't know how to say it, but I find that sometimes the interpretation is not really a role. We can't even say, we have to do a clarification on what Rawls would say about this. For example, the integrity objection as well. So it's not clear that political reason is actually something, public reason is actually something that violates the integrity of people. I mean, so sometimes I find that there are some key concepts in both theories that we have to either clarify what's being said, because so my question is on the reconciliation project, and if the differences of the both projects from a Rawlsian framework or from
yeah, let me just say three things quickly, because I gather that the slowing pace of the stream of questions suggests people are tired. I know it's late there, and this is the third session of the day, so I won't keep you long. I'll just make three quick points. First, if you're saying that when you read Vallier and Muldoon or other people in that camp, you see Rawlsian vocabulary being used in a way that doesn't seem quite familiar from Rawls's text, you're not alone, or at least I feel your pain. I have the same experience. Second, I do think you're quite right that Rawls is talking about reconciling people to the social order and the rage that they may feel at the institutions under which they live. That's a different project than reconciling religious citizens to the institutions under which they live, or to liberal institutions. Unless, of course, one thinks that religious citizens feel rage at the social order. Maybe some do, maybe some don't. Whether or not reconciling those who do is an important project, and reconciling religious citizens to those with whom they disagree is an important project, even if it doesn't map as neatly onto Rawls's project as its proponents suggest. But third, I don't think that the only way to reconcile religious citizens to liberal political institutions is Vallier's way. I mean, I think that may be one way. It's a way that's worth exploring. It's not the way that I would favor, and I don't think that it's the only one.
Thank you very much, Professor Paul Weithman, Professor Erin Kelly. With that, I think that we can close the panel, thanking everybody for being here. Both talks were very stimulating for us, and so I'd really like to thank you. And Nitamar, if you want to say anything, I would just...
Well, just to reinforce our gratefulness to both Professor Weithman, Professor Kelly. Thank you very much. This was very, very precious contribution to our symposium. And you'll see you guys around tomorrow. Wish you all a good night.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks.
Stay
Bye-bye.
healthy.
Bye, Erin. See you soon.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
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 Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.